So, do you want to start or shall I?
Um, you start
Okay.
if you like.
Well, I've known you for a little while now, Tim. I really want to find out more about how you you arrived here in this amazing place, quite a long time ago, I think. What what drew you to this very place?
So, I think it was 18 years, about, yeah, 18 years, I think, when I first moved here. So, I was in London. I'd done 10 years in London after starting art college there, and kind of did as much London as I could before it was no longer working for me. Um, I was, kind of young artist, but
Hmm.
somehow trying or kind of in that at the height of my idealism and trying to bring down capitalism with art or something like that. I don't know, but it didn't work, whatever it was. Um, and I think I just sort of couldn't really find a way to continue being there that worked for me, and I was feeling like there was something bigger calling. And I wasn't, friends of mine who were at college were sort of starting to get into the gallery system and engaging with the art world, and that I just didn't feel like that was right for me. So I was looking for something else, and I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew that it was getting out of the city. And I had friends who were from Norfolk, who used to go back from London quite often. And a couple of times I came up here with them for a visit, um, and really fell in love with the place, the area. And then I got a commission from a bookseller, Simon Finch, who has a beautiful arts and crafts house
Hmm.
just outside of Holt called Voewood.
Hmm.
And he just bought this place. It had been a nursing home, and he was sort of restoring it to its original glory. And he commissioned me to make a bookcase for the billiard room. So I came and spent a summer working on that and stayed at the house and got to live here. And that's when I knew this is where I want to be, because
Hmm.
I'd actually been immersed in it for 2 months or whatever it was. So then I approached a mutual friend who was the landowner here, um, and asked him if he had any places for rent, for working or living. And he said, well, there's an old forestry shed on the edge of the woods, which you could maybe use as a workspace. And he drove me up here one day to have a look. And as soon as I saw it, I knew I'd found my home. And at
Hmm.
that point, it was a derelict building. It very gloomy, completely kind of surrounded by tall pine trees. Not a lot of light getting in quite a sorry state. And this was November as well, so it's probably the least glamorous month of the year. But as soon as we drove up, I just completely felt in my body that I was home. There was something so familiar um, about the place, and that was it. I said, "Well, I'll live there," and he didn't mind.
Hmm.
He was like, "Okay, whatever." So that was a great stroke of luck, just his kind of blessing in a way, straight away. Um, so I just moved in. I made a little box in the corner. I kind of, because it was a wooden frame with corrugated sheet metal on it, basically, just empty inside, full of sort of rubbish and broken bits of sheet pen and what have you. Um, and I just moved in and made a little sort of survival box in the corner. All it had was water, which was to me the most essential utility. So I made my little box. On the first night we just slept because a friend of mine, John from London, came up, and we just slept on straw bales with no fire or anything. The second night we put in a wood burner and it improved like 10,000%. So, I mean, straight away it felt like, wow, we're on our way, you know. And then I made I put in a little sink and a bed and a table and basically spent the first winter just camping inside, really, um, just to see if I could do it. I also thought if I move in November, if I can survive the winter, I'll be fine, you know. And I knew every day I was sort of working on it, fixing it up, fixing the gutter, patching up the holes, you know, bit by bit, making it more habitable. And that first winter it had that kind of beauty of simplicity.
Mm.
I was living such a simple existence, and yeah, just in retreat, I became a bit of a hermit for a few months, um, and it was very beautiful. It was my Walden, I guess. That's what
Mm.
it was. It was a
Mm.
bit of a Walden for me,
Yeah.
and this the sort of tentative getting to know the land around and meeting the animals and the trees, and you know, all very gently it was happening. But I felt so completely at home from the beginning
Yeah.
that it was just becoming familiar with the details, because the ground feeling was one of just belonging from the very start.
It sounds almost like you suddenly went back into a more primitive way of life.
Yeah, it really was. I I did drop the whole way of life that I had before, um, and I would. That's what I wanted. I just
Mm.
wanted to simplify and strip it down to the most essential things. You know, really survival and almost kind of rebuilding a life from the beginning again. Like, what would it be to start living again and to work out what matters and what doesn't and what's
Mm.
valuable, and by getting rid of all the things that I was familiar with or I was dependent on, you know, all the kind of conveniences, washing machines, hot water, you know, flushing toilets,
Mm.
by just going back to, you know, I had water and I had a roof over my head and I was surrounded by woodland, so there was
Mm.
firewood.
Mm.
Um, and then I could piece it back together. And I think I didn't know it at the time, but there was such value in that. I mean, the first great moment of really knowing that, apart from the first night of getting fire and heat, which was monumental, but maybe like 2 or 3 years, maybe 2 years after that, was the first time I had hot running water there. So I used to go around to friends' houses for, you know, for a bath once a week or whatever it was, or I just heat up hot water on the fire and wash myself.
Mm.
You know, and I was going to the laundrette, so I was still using those kind of modern conveniences, but it was modern inconveniences because it was, you know, a bit of a hassle. But when I first put in the Rayburn with a back boiler, which was how I heated water, what a Rayburn that an old guy in the village had given me, um, he'd had it in his shed. A guy called Derek, who's dead now, but he was one of a few local people who were so supportive and excited about what I was doing. And he said, "Oh, I've got an old Rayburn in the shed that we took out 15 years ago. You can have that." So we went over and put it on the back of a tractor and brought it round. And I plumbed it in and connected it up and put a bath in. And that first hot bath I had was the most luxurious experience of my life. And even now, every time I get into that bath, I have a sort of flashback experience
Yeah.
of appreciating how amazing hot water is. And if you've gone without it for a little while, um, as I had, it just became such a luxury thing. And I've never actually taken it for granted since then. And I do still get that feeling of pleasure every time I get in the bath. And because I can visualize how the whole process works, from cutting the firewood to putting it in the fire to the hot water in the tank just rising by gravity, like hot water is lighter, so it moves up the pipe. So there's no moving parts. Goes into the tank, heats the water, and because I knew it
mm,
intimately, I had this whole relationship with it that enhanced the pleasure somehow as well. So yeah, that was. And there were lots of stages like that. I mean, the most recent one, only what 2 years ago, I got a good enough generator that I could run a washing machine. And now having a washing machine is, washing the clothes is one of my hobbies, and I absolutely love it. Any excuse to put the washing machine on, because it's such a miracle when you
right.
haven't had one for a long time. Incredible
But
things.
amazing. I've been listening to Robinson Crusoe on the radio, and uh, you're sort of reminding me of all that. It's almost as if you were cast adrift on a desert island, and you had to start again from scratch. But you were doing it willingly because something in you had decided that you didn't want the alternative, and it's as if you started from scratch and were rebuilding a whole different relationship, maybe with your own life. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think something like that. It was like my way of trying to fix what I saw as a broken situation. I think because, as is, being proven now, I suppose, even back then, I knew that this way of life was totally toxic and wasn't going to end well. And something deep in me just wanted to try and live in a good way, in the right way, in a better way. But obviously, I couldn't. I couldn't be separate from it. I was still completely enmeshed in this culture. But it was kind of my way of somehow getting back some authorship over that, or some control over that, or trying to do it well, or using hand tools again, and learning old skills, and developing a relationship with a place that had meaning. It was like a way to find some meaning. I think that's
Mm,
probably at the base of it. Is I felt
mm.
like the culture I was born into had no meaning, and I was desperate to find meaning. Um,
So was that almost your sort of career here? That because I'm thinking you made the big decision to be here, and it's sort of then what? Because just self-sufficiency and survival is incredibly labor intensive and becomes your whole life. You don't. A lot of people who've done that historically, there isn't much time for much else. That just getting by becomes your whole life.
yeah, well, I realized very quickly that the idea of self-sufficiency, and there's a lot, it's a bit of a fantasy in our culture. Lots of people want to do it, but
Mm,
of course, truly self-sufficient communities are communities, and that's how they do it. When you're on your own, it's survival, and when you're on your own in kind of conflict in a way, or out of sync with the culture you're in, it's even harder. And I tried to do a lot of everything myself. I mean, that was my kind of naive vision at the start, was I'm going to grow all my food. And but I realized very quickly that for true self-sufficiency, you need a community of people doing that too, because it's simply too much work. um, unless you were in an environment where there was abundant wildlife and you could hunt and do it like that, maybe, but not in England in 20 whatever 2003 or whenever it was, because
mm.
all the land is owned, it's farmed, it's managed, and you need certain things like electricity or kind of whatever, fuel for your car, or a car even to get around. And
mm,
so I knew very quickly that self-sufficiency wasn't something I could do. And I kind of, it was a really good lesson, that thing of, oh, it's community that enables that, actually. And the people who have in kind of history survived on their own were doing just that, surviving. They weren't living, I don't think. They were,
mm,
it really would be survival. And I think understanding that we are completely dependent on each other in some
mm,
fundamental way as humans, that we're not solitary in that sense.
no,
Um, and I recognized, or in time I recognized, that I was supported in, you know, all kinds of ways, maybe not so visible or conscious, by the culture,
mm,
and there was a kind of luxury in what I was doing, in, being able to kind of drop out, but, not really. I don't think that's actually possible. I mean, you
right,
could live homeless on the streets of a city, but you're still, living off the kind of the bits that
mm,
drop to the floor or whatever, or the charity, or the,
mm.
it's almost impossible, I think, to be totally self-sufficient.
You mentioned Derek providing you with a Rayburn. Were there other specific people who and events that helped you around those early
It
times?
was it was an interesting kind of study of village life as well. All the people that were really helpful and positive and supportive were the kind of proper Norfolk locals that had been here forever, born and bred in the village. And all the people who were very difficult and suspicious, and because, I was a single man arriving in the woods in a derelict building, so you can imagine, I'm not
Yeah,
in the village, on the edge of the village. So
right.
all the kind of Daily Mail reading, curtain twitching, busybody types were going crazy. Were sort of thought the devil had arrived, because they didn't know
Yeah.
me, obviously. So I had a very different, and lots of those people seemed to be people who'd moved into the village, retired there. There was a real clear line between those people who are very open and supportive and quite light-hearted about it and saw it as a bit of an adventure and something exciting, to those who were like, why aren't you following the rules? You're not supposed to be, that kind of, this doesn't fit into my idea of what people are supposed to do. So
Mm,
it was a really interesting sort of schism, I guess, cultural
mm,
community and the relationships. And of course, my strategy from the start, which I think is my life kind of strategy, is just to always be pleasant and kind to people, no matter what they're doing, how awful or, nosy or kind of difficult they're being, to have a clear boundary, but not to get drawn in to a conflict. Because I could see there were so many times when I could have been pulled into a fight about whether I should be here, did it have permission, and all of that. And I chose just to kind of, yeah, just to play that very gently and with a long term view, I guess. I didn't know I
mm,
could be here because it wasn't, it didn't have residential status, so
mm.
I wasn't officially supposed to be here, so I did have to play a bit of a game.
I imagine that's changed over the years. There's been some
Yeah, it finally,
journey.
I mean, it was funny because at first there was an initial kind of response from the council where somebody had called up to complain and somebody was sent round, an enforcement officer. Um, and I had to play a bit of a game with them at that point, saying, "Oh no, I wasn't living there, and I went to stay with some friends in Barney in the next village." And then eventually, my neighbours, I was very fortunate in having some great neighbours who were very sympathetic. They took me in as a lodger in one of their sort of
Yeah, right,
outbuildings to
right.
kind of to take the heat off, which it did, because then the word got round that I was living at theirs, and that was fine. And then
Yeah.
I just very slowly moved back in again. But everyone thought, who was bothered, thought that I lived
Yeah.
there. So it sort
Oh,
of
right.
disarmed that kind of fear. And of course, in this time, people had got to meet me and know me a bit more. So most of the
Mm,
reasonable people realized I was actually all right. It was just the diehards who, just whose sense of order and how things should be done was being offended that couldn't quite forgive
mm,
me. But over time, I became a part of the village. As you do, people
mm,
get used to you, and we some of the things we did kind of made it so that I was more accepted, maybe. And it was only recently, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, when the, somebody new moved, or didn't even move in. They bought a house on the end of the street, which is opposite the shed here, on the other side of the field, so they could see us from there. And I don't know what gossip they'd heard, but basically the person who bought the house called up the council to complain that I was living here and it wasn't a residential building. And this person hadn't wasn't even going to live here, had just bought the house as a holiday let, as an investment, so wasn't actually living in the village. And I had 2 children at this point, and was basically, that was his way of arriving on the scene, was to call up the council. So then there was a whole, I know, incredible. I mean, it amazes me that such people exist, but they do. And but it was a blessing. It worked well, because there was this wonderful then sort of village meeting called, where I was summoned to the village hall to answer questions from everybody, which I agreed to. I thought, well, yeah, I will come and tell you what I'm doing. And all the people who were bothered by me, so the village, I was there, sat in front of the whole village, and everyone came out because it was the most entertaining thing that happened in a long time, the Inquisition. And all the village, the parish council were there on their table, and I was sat in the middle, and then the audience, the villagers. And the parish council were then sort of sitting there saying, okay, can people who have questions or who've made complaints now kind of ask me their questions? And none of the people that complained had showed up, including this guy who'd caused all the trouble. So then the parish council got all annoyed and upset, because they were like, well, we've called this meeting and you're not here to ask questions. So they were asking me questions. So we went, so I kind of held my ground and was, again, very reasonable, and tried to explain what I was doing and this and that. And it seemed to go quite well. But the upshot was that the council came round again, one of their enforcement officers, and he basically said, well, you've been living here for 7 years now, and there's nothing we can do to get you out. Basically, you've kind of established a right to be there. And he said, well, you can either, or you can apply for some kind of license to be here, which will cost 350 quid, whatever it is, like almost like a planning, a sort of temporary planning permission or something. License, it was a kind of license. But he said, you can do that to make it official, but it will make no difference, because we can't make you leave anyway. So it's up to you. If you want to get that piece of paper and spend £350, then do, or or don't. Either way, you can be there now, was the upshot. And
mm.
their sort of welcoming present was to then serve me with a 7-year council tax bill, which was the longest period they could backdate council tax. That was their
Right.
sort of, I got my 2 wheelie bins and my 7-year
Uh,
council tax bill, which I
yeah.
managed to kind of negotiate down to something reasonable. But yeah.
Okay. So did that feel like rejoining the world, having 2 wheelie bins?
Yeah, that was a little bit like, okay, yeah, we're back in society again.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was quite a story, and I think this is a story for a lot of people who are trying to live on the land again, and how
Mm,
difficult that is planning laws are good and useful and stop a lot of terrible things happening. Um, However, they need to update to this kind of growing desire to be back on the land. And ultimately, all along throughout this process, I felt like all I'm doing is living in a building. There is nothing wrong with this. This should be allowed. I'm improving the building, I'm improving the surroundings, and I'm bringing all the things that I brought to the area. So I felt like on another level, I was justified in what I was doing. And I think because I felt like that, and I always felt so right here and like I belonged, and because I didn't get involved in any fights or conflict or give that any energy, I sort of just believed it would always work out. And I think that had some bearing on it being,
Yeah.
I genuinely believe that that helped it come to pass that I could be here.
Interesting. I know because you've told me that you brought from your flat in London some genetic material, uh, which I think is really interesting in hindsight. That this was the start of something. Do you want to say something
Yeah, so
about that?
trees.
Really?
So the year before I left London, I was going around all the parks, all the streets, finding tree seeds from trees that I liked. Or, London is a wonderful city for trees. It's full of trees and really a huge range of trees from all over the world, obviously, in Kew and the parks, but even in the streets, and in the gardens. So I don't even remember why, or I didn't really have a clear plan, but I sort of had a vague idea of I wanted to start um, an arboretum or something, like is that the right word?
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of plant uh, an arboretum of trees from all over the world at some point. So I started collecting the seeds, and I'd go and spend a day in Kew, secretly kind of taking,
Yeah, we've
acorns
all
off.
done it. We've all done it.
We've all done it, yeah. And and more kind of visibly in other more public places. But I ended up with a whole collection of seeds that I was keeping in my fridge, and some of them I put into pots on my roof terrace. I was living in Bow, in the last place I lived, sort of sandwiched between the River Lee and the Blackwall Tunnel approach, which is like a 6-lane motorway on an island of kind of industrial buildings. And we were in an old fire station, which was one beautiful little brick building in amongst these enormous, kind of mysterious, almost kind of governmental looking compounds, where nothing ever happened. They were just these huge buildings that maybe a van would come in the night. Or so we're in this really quite urban place, and on my roof I had all these little pots with tree seedlings. And that was the year before I moved out. So when I finally came to move, I had a load of trees growing. So I had a Land Rover at the time, and I had a roof rack. So I put all my little seedlings on the roof rack and drove up the M11 with my Land Rover with this little wood kind of waving on the roof, and all my seeds that had kind of survived in the fridge. And then I got here, and at that point, or shortly after I'd moved in, I'd sort of negotiated use of one of the bits of land here, which was part of an old agricultural field, which I sort of hedged off, and I planted the trees at the top of the field. Um, and and the seeds by that time, or after a month or two, I'd realized that all these exotic species of tree I wasn't that interested in anymore. Just by spending a little bit of time here, I got to see the more subtle beauty of the native trees and it completely changed my view. And I even very quickly at the beginning, I realized me just imposing my ideas on the place was never going to work, and that I was actually there to listen, and it was going to show me what I needed to do rather than me just take it. But I did plant some of these trees um, at the top of the field, and you know, some, I was just up there only the other day and remembering that there are black walnut trees now, which are, you know, 15 years old or more. Um, well, yeah, more. And, you know, and I gave my neighbour one of them as well, and she's now got this huge black walnut tree, which has got a walnut on it for the first time that I've ever seen this year. And they came from an enormous, majestic black walnut that's in Battersea Park, on the west end of Battersea Park, towering like 40-metre high tree. And they've just started producing walnuts. And it's a small wood now at the top of the field. It was a shelter belt for an orchard that I put in afterwards. But it's a place, it's a wood. And there's something so magical about that whole process over time of seeing it grow. And then you kind of forget it as well, or I did sometimes. And then suddenly remembering, oh my God, I grew these from seeds, you know, looking up in the air at a huge tree. And there's something quite wonderful about that.
Yeah. That's great. I am fortunate that I share that experience of planting trees and seeing them grow. What other trees have you got on that area as well?
So, and this was a kind of purely fortuitous accident, really. But where I lived at Bow, on along the edge of the canal that I used to walk up to go to the supermarket at Three Mills, was there were all these Italian alders planted, and I collected some seeds from those and grew those, and I put those in at the top, sort of spaced out. And it was only years later when I discovered forest gardening and Martin Crawford, who's down in Devon, and he plants Italian alders as nitrogen fixers. They're kind of like keystone trees within his forest garden because they're tall and thin. He cuts off the lower branches, and they're just feeding all of the trees around with nitrogen from their leaves and from the root system. And I've now got them all spread out doing the same thing purely by accident because I hadn't planned it that way. And I've got a kind of proto forest garden happening up there now, and that's what I intend to do, is to sort of underplant it and work with that. But again, just from tiny little seeds. And I've also, the other exciting thing I've got there is apple pippins grown from pips, which with apples, if you want to say grow a Granny Smith or something, the same variety, you have to take a cutting and graft it onto a rootstock, and then you'll get the same fruit. But every time you plant a pip, you potentially have a new variety, or you know, some kind of mix of whichever other apples were kind of involved in the pollination of the flower. And I've got, for the first time 2 years ago, I think it was, 7 or 8 of those trees produced fruit, flowered and produced fruit. And most of them are delicious. And they may well be new varieties of apple. So I've got all of those up there as well, which is super exciting. So my intention is, I've already named a few of them after my girls, and you know, and various other names. But I'm going to take some to an apple day when they produce again and see if they are like something else, or maybe they're completely new. But you know, I'm going to sort of treat them as new ones anyway, because they are pretty much. I mean, you know, they must be slightly different, even if they're quite close to something else.
Yeah, I love the idea that these are what you brought with you from, weirdly, from the city, and that now they're forming part of this new phase of your life, but they've taken that long to become producing trees.
Yeah, the whole process, the time of it, and the spread of things. You know, we have all these ideas about native and non-native, but of course, everything that moves around the world is native eventually, because that's how nature spreads things, right? You
Mm,
know, the Ice Age came, erased all the plant life in Britain, but when it went, everything that's here now came from Europe or further
mm,
afield. So
mm.
that's how, you know, and we're just vectors for seeds like birds are, or, you know, so a
Yeah,
roof rack on a Land Rover, it's no different really from a bird, you know, flying and dropping a seed, or a jay burying an acorn, or a squirrel, you know, whatever it is.
yeah.
Yeah.
Is there a way that you can, looking back, um, sort of describe to yourself the evolution of how your relationship with this place has happened, how that has changed and evolved over this time?
Yeah, it's been so subtle. It's been a kind of weaving of myself into the land in such a subtle way. And because there was no plan, it was all very instinctive. I was just feeling my way around it, you know, following my inclinations and my fascinations, and wanting to learn, you know, how to manage woodland, how to coppice, how to use a bill hook and a chainsaw, and you know, how to grow things, and wanting to put trees in the landscape or look after trees that are self-sown. You know, there's
Mhm.
a birch tree here that I picked out amongst the bracken and cleared around it and protected it. And we, you know, we built a little outhouse, little toilet there for a few years. And when that kind of fell into ruin and we moved it somewhere else, suddenly the tree had all this space, and now it's this wonderful, tall, graceful birch tree. And and this kind of illustrates it. It's like slowly, without you really noticing, something becomes something, and
Mm,
that's kind of what's happened to me. Is I've slowly become a part of the place. I've just, by eating it, working it, loving it, listening to it, watching it, all those different things, I've just become woven into it. It's a kind, I feel like it's a sort of indigenization. It's like a remembering a very natural thing in us as animals, which is that we do indigenize by nature, because that's most of our history, I guess, has been that, is having a deep, complex relationship with the places where we've lived. And I've kind of been in a sort of indigenization school or something, but unwittingly, you know.
mm.
Yeah.
Has
I
that
don't know
given
if I
you?
answered your question, but it's been a gradual, it's been a love affair. I have to say that actually, from the very beginning, I've loved this place and felt that reciprocated. It was love at first sight, and it's been love all along. Yeah.
Have there ever been moments where you thought you might fall out of love with it or not?
Not the place. It's always been the human story, or things that have happened around people, or the culture that have made it difficult or challenging. The place has always felt right. I've had that need to go somewhere else and have a break and come back with fresh eyes, but as soon as I get back, I feel so, you know, at home again. And it's only the human level that's made me doubt whether or not I should continue to be here, and the sort of conditions and intricacies of that,
Mm,
challenges of that. The actual place itself, because it's never the same place twice in any consecutive second. You know, it's always different, as everywhere
Mm.
is, when you're really looking at it and noticing it. Every season, every year, everything is growing, and you know, the procession of growth from, you know, a bare space to a full woodland, or the other way around, clearing something. It's always moving. The animals are changing.
Mm.
You know, the whole land here became organic farmland around it, almost
Right.
like the year I moved in. And the change in the landscape because of the organic farming has been incredible. The number of plants and animals and insects and birds, just life that's appeared since that has happened, has been very
Mm.
inspiring, and kind of hope kind of giving to me, to see how when humans allow it to come back, it comes back so strongly and so quickly.
Do you think it's given you a different sense of your relationship with time when you live like this?
Yeah, there's a sort of accessing of the timeless dimension, for sure, that it's a kind of schizophrenia, because on the one side there's the human, the jarring kind of human culture, which has all these demands on me, like I need to make a living, there's this, there's that. And then there's everything else, the sort of natural order. And that is so connected to the timeless, to the sacred, I would say, that it's in a whole, it is in fact another dimension, it seems to me. And the human world is so challenging and difficult and awkward, and full of time and urgency, and there's not enough time, and oh god, I can't get it all done, and all of those stories. But the natural world and order is completely timeless, and things just happen in this ever rolling progression. And every time I meet a wild animal that's completely present and in the moment, I'm reminded of that state of things. And that is what I find to be sacred. That's the only word I can use for it, because it's such a different feeling when you really notice a place, or an insect or an animal,
Mm.
because they're just so there.
Mm.
And it's kind of like, the irony is that it's what we're looking for culturally. You know, all the great sort of religions and traditions and studies are all trying to get towards this place of enlightenment, and all of the plants and animals around us are doing it all the time. And we're kind of looking somewhere for it, and we're completely surrounded by it. That's how it sort of seems to me. And it's easier, I suppose, for me to be in connection with that natural sacred dimension. All my challenges come from the human cultural zone. Yeah.
Yeah, I really get a sense from your talking of how much the place nurtures you, and and how I can see how just how much you get from that. And in a way, you, you're kind of pioneering, in my view, you're pioneering something that you've committed to doing this for 20 years, and to working with it and understanding it and learning from nature and the way that it presents itself to you and the way you feel connected with it, and of how much it gives back to you. Because I think maybe people who haven't had your experience don't don't have a feeling of how much can be given to you by nature just by engaging with nature, even in a small way, even in a small garden. How much energy and um, presence, like you were talking about, how much can be given back to you.
Mm. God, absolutely. I think it's this infinite supply of everything we could ever need. that's what's kind of tragic, comical, beautiful. It's all those things, because all of the addictions we have, all of this striving that we do as humans, with this constant kind of looking for something, it's all around us all the time, just there waiting. And it really is everything we could ever need. It's more entertaining than any entertainment. It's more beautiful than any works of art. It's got everything, absolutely everything, and even the practical things. Obviously, all the resources, all the food, all the materials we need to live. It has everything we need in a profound and deep way. And I suppose trying to make sense of what I've been doing, because there are two stories. There's just the very natural animal I've just been trying to live in a way that feels true and good and right and beautiful, in a very simple, it sounds pretentious, but it's very unpretentious. It's just a very simple wanting to live well. And then there's the whole human thing, where I'm trying to make sense of it, or fit it into the culture, or explain it, or you know, translate it into a way of life that I can earn a living, so I can support my family. And you know, and really what I feel I've been shown is that what we need is right under our feet. And it's, if we can find a way to relate in a right way again with the living landscape, it will give us everything we need. And it feels like, I mean, it's, you know, it's impossible not to kind of put yourself at the center of your own life, I guess, but it feels like if there's any purpose or reason to me having gone on this journey for all these years, it's to somehow remember that and hopefully convey it to other people. Now at this point, I'm feeling more called to share some of that, and not, you know, not say I know something you don't. Really, just point and sort of say, have you seen this? Do you want to come and have a look at this? And you come and have your experience of it, because I don't know what that will be, but I have a place here that I can make comfortable for you to come into, where you can maybe meet that in favorable circumstances. And I feel like that's really what I'm being called to do now. There's two parts to it. One is that is facilitating connection with the profound beauty of nature, and our true nature as well, and the nature of others. Those things are all together. That's one part. And the other part is I want to grow plants and trees and create a forest garden and a nursery of plants that can be distributed within this region, that provides plants that are adapted to this particular climate of our region. And as the climate's changing rapidly, try and experiment and see what we can grow to build a kind of food, medicinal, useful resilience in the landscape, and kind of do my bit with the time I've got left to create a place here, even if I'm not, you know, ultimately benefiting from it, or my family, but somebody might, you know, in the future. There may be, or maybe it's just the ecosystem, creating the most complex, rich, resilient ecosystem I can on this land in the time I've got left. So those two aspects feel like a deep calling right now for me. And maybe the sort of fruit of what I've been doing on this long apprenticeship, perhaps. Right. But, you know, that's me trying to make it fit into a sort of rational. But that's the story I'm going with at the moment, anyway.
Well, it sounds like it's a great story. It is a great story. That I like the word you use, apprenticeship, because, and that we don't always know we're in an apprenticeship. We kind of think, oh, well, I'm the finished article, or we might think, oh, I don't know what I'm doing. But that idea that there is a process that we're in, and that we can sort of just sense that process at times and go, oh, okay, yeah, no, I see what I'm in now, and then it becomes clear what's happening, and we don't have to know all the steps, just the next one, this one and the next one, or a sense of the next one. But I'm excited for you, and what you were just saying was really interesting, because this sort of functional level of growing things, working out what's resilient, what's important, what's useful, what's maybe medicinal, but also good food. And that's just very practical. And then my sense is, just by engaging in that practical way, whether one is growing a few things in your garden or planting a few trees, that just through that engagement, there is this byproduct of connection that happens, that you can't control it. You can't, it's not at your bidding. But if you're open to it, then it, like we were saying earlier, it will give an enormous amount to you. Even if, so I get incredibly excited by having one plant that's growing on the windowsill, in the kitchen. It's like every day I'm excited by how this is unfolding. And when you see something coming up from nothing and revealing its leaves for the first time, it's like something it is giving birth. And I think we're having to learn this connection again, because we've got rather disconnected. And I really respect that you've gone on this rather difficult journey in lots of ways. I know it hasn't been really easy, but I feel like you've learned so much and have an enormous amount to offer through what you've learned and what you want to give back. I think it's great, amazing.
Yeah, thanks. It's also the other piece that I missed out was that there's the beauty aspect as well in everything. I guess because of the artist in me and the art background, this has kind of become the art, and it's a co-creation, it's a collaboration with the living place. And my job is always to try and create beauty in these things that I'm doing. And there is an aesthetic dimension to it as well that is a fascinating and endless thing, because it's like a living artwork. It's always changing, and it's throwing up things itself that you didn't expect, or animals come in and change it. So it's a kind of slightly chaotic relationship, but it's a creative act, obviously. I mean, it's life, it's creation. And there's all the satisfaction in creation that I got from writing poems or making sculpture. I get that from this kind of relationship and the work I do. But there's also all of the satisfaction and inspiration I get from seeing great art that I get from the landscape. And there's also the love pouring out of it. So it contains all these things simultaneously. I mean, it really is, it's the whole form thing, because it has all the resources for eating, for firewood, for building. It has all the kind of spiritual moments of meeting animals or seeing a sunrise or the moon coming up over the field. It's got all these different layers to it that make up a complete human life. And it all the things that we kind of create in culture, for whatever reason we do that, the land is doing that all the time. I guess we did that in a kind of form of reverence, or to sort of acknowledge the wonder and the sacredness of being alive and existing and seeing what nature had for us. Maybe that's why we create culture in the first place. I don't know.
Well, that's interesting, because because I'm interested in landscape painting, and just the idea that we might be able, if we live in a town, have a landscape painting on our wall that reminds us of an Arcadian Eden-like vision of where we all came from. I'm kind of fascinated by that. And this, yeah, but this is real, yeah. And it's not an image, it's not a painting. It's it has the actual energy of nature that you're describing. So I can imagine people coming here and really getting a lot just from being here. And I mean, I've walked around some of the woods, and like you say, one never knows what is going on inside other people and the way we're responding to things. But I always think of really things come down to willingness, and if I can somehow internally decide to be open, then the possibilities are endless. Really, experientially, the possibilities are endless.
Good. That's a good place to leave it. I like that. That's a nice thought to leave on.